It was, with hindsight, the beginning of the end. 80 years ago this week, with the Second World War raging in every corner of the globe, Allied troops began the liberation of Europe and the end of Nazi Germany. Allied troops from Britain, the United States and Canada were supported by Australian, Belgian, Czech, Dutch, French, Greek, New Zealand, Norwegian, Rhodesian and Polish naval, air and ground support. Tens of thousands landed on 5 beaches in Normandy. Airborne forces dropped behind enemy lines.
What I heard was gunfire of every description, machine guns, cannon, bombs.
It was a bloody battle. For some, a massacre. Thousands lost their lives, many before even stepping foot on dry land. Yet by nightfall on the 6th of June 1944, more than 150,000 troops had arrived and secured a position in France. 11 months later, the Nazis would be defeated.
And that was it. I was a free man.
We now know it simply as D-Day. 80 years on, Sky News has spoken to 3 of the dwindling number of veterans to remember the day in their own words. I'm Niall Paterson. Welcome to the Sky News Daily.
It was just an adventure. It was like, I suppose, to some extent, like being in the Scouts.
Now, that is Ken Hay, 18 years of age during the Normandy landings.
You were learning things. You learned how to strip a Bren gun and blindfold and put it back and name the parts, and you learned to drill. You were meeting new people, you making friends. We didn't do it for medals or anything like that. It was just that Britain had to be defended. The continent wanted liberating, and all that was all part of a parcel.
He decided to give up his girlfriend at the time in order to fight for his country.
We were the same age, 16, when we met, at a Home Guard dance. But when I knew something was going to happen, I wrote to her and said, don't wait for me. I had a sense that something was going to happen to me. And so I said, don't wait for me, just lead your own life and we've had fun. And I broke it off with her.
He served in the 43rd Essex Regiment and landed on the Normandy beaches on D-Day.
In fact, we were on a 30-mile route march around Sussex on D-Day. We saw the planes going over, because we didn't have radios and all that sort of thing that people, all these little gadgets that people wander around with now, none of this sort. But the message came that the second front had been opened. And then we got the news it was Normandy. And we knew that that's where we were headed.
But on the night of the 7th of June, Ken was captured.
We were put into wagons, and there were 40 men and a lidded dustbin for a toilet. And you had to use the toilet in front of those 40 men. We were on that for 6.5 days and nights. And we finished up in southern Poland at a place now called in Polish Ciecyn. In those days it had a German name, Teschen. Yes, you were frightened. But you couldn't show it in front of others, so you had to keep that to yourself.
Ken and his fellow prisoners of war were forced to work in coal mines.
Well, it was Christmas Eve. We didn't have the coal cutting as normal down the mine because the miners had been given the weekend off. But they'd called back in some old engineers and retired people to do maintenance work. And I was allocated to a little man, quite small, with a big peak cap. He was some sort of mechanic. And I had to hold up pipes of stuff while he used a very long spanner to screw them up. I was just thinking about home. I wonder if midnight mass had started again because it was stopped during the war and the Blitz. I wonder if the folks had gone. And I found myself singing Silent Night. And the little man said, Tommy, that is good music. So I said, yeah, it's good music. Tommy, that is Deutsch music, German music. So yeah, it's Deutsch music. And he started singing. Now, I found out later he was 72. So he was rather falsetto, and I thought I was the second Bing Crosby. So we did a duet down there of Silent Night. And I just stood there and thought about home. And I have to confess, I stood there and cried. Because we weren't even sure then we'd ever get home, you know. And it was a long way away.
Near the end of the war, Ken and 80,000 other prisoners from Nazi camps were forced to walk more than 1,000 miles. Many died on what became known as the Long March.
It was bitter weather when we started, 23rd of January. We marched the first day all day and all night. And we are slipping. It's not marching as left, right. It's slipping and sliding on the snow and the ice and so on. Bitterly cold. We did get to a camp, and the British prisoners in there, but they made us mugs of tea with a shovel full of sugar in it. It was beautiful after marching all day and all night. And then they said, right, we're moving next day to another. And that went on for 3 months, all but 2 days. We finished on the 20th of April. And at night, we could hear gunfire way to the west and the odd machine gun. And we knew that it had to be Brits or Americans. The German officer said, all right, but we said, we're not marching anymore. He said, we'll have a rest day, we'll march tomorrow. Yeah, we'll march tomorrow. But that night, the stuff was much closer, and he recognised that war was finished. And so we waited, that was Friday or Saturday, and on the Sunday, 2 American tanks. And somebody yelled out, "Here's some tanks." So they all went running. I was on a walking stick at the time, so I went limping on behind. They were throwing out packets of cigarettes and bars of chocolate and so on. And I think one sort of took pity on Tiny Tim coming on behind, as it were, and he reached in and it was a packet about that size, and he just threw it. And I caught it, and it said Wrigley's. And I thought, just my luck, I'm starving, and all I get is bloody chewing gum. And that was it. I was a free man.
And do you remember that girlfriend that Ken got rid of before he served his country? Well, he ended up marrying her. 80 years on, Ken lives in Upminster in East London and has a passion for educating younger generations, regularly speaking to schools about his experiences in the Second World War. He treasures the many letters children have written to him, thanking him for his service all those years ago. Thank you, Ken Hay. But of course, it wasn't just those on the beaches of Normandy that were responsible for the ultimate success of the operation. It was a huge effort on land, sea and air, but also at home with the logistical support needed to coordinate such a massive incursion. Back in the UK, Marie Scott, now 87, was a D-Day switchboard operator in an underground location in Portsmouth.
When I got to Fort Southwark, which was the name of the centre, I was put on the switchboard, which was a 9-position switchboard. It was a very busy board, all top serving officers, SHAEF, people like General Eisenhower, General Montgomery, and messages and communication was being passed from one to the other. So yes, it was a busy time, and because we used to do fairly long shifts, I didn't see much of the activity in Portsmouth Harbour, which was the amassing of the great flotilla of ships to invade Europe. I had no idea that was going on because I was deep underground in Portsmouth.
Marie was just 17 at the time, but what she heard on the radio has remained with her forever.
I was operating something that I knew as a VHF set, very high frequency. So it was a radio set. And it was, I think, in its infancy at that time. And it was a simple square box-like thing with levers. But it was a one-way system only. So whilst one person was talking, the other had to remain silent. So when I lifted my lever to pass a message, they would acknowledge the receipt. Then they would lift their lever to respond. And on D-Day, 1944, as they lifted their lever, I realised with whom I was in touch. And that was the troops who were actually landing on the beaches for D-Day. Because what I heard was gunfire of every description, machine guns, cannon, bombs, aircraft, men shouting, men screaming, men rapping out orders. It was the general chaos of war that I had in my ears. To begin with, I was a little afraid, but I was deep underground, so I had no reason to be afraid. But those men were landing on the beaches as we were passing messages. But it's the men who are the real heroes, because they were laying down their lives. As they were storming those beaches, they were dying, some of them.
After the war, Marie went on to live what she describes as a normal life in Kingston-upon-Thames in Surrey. And, like many others, she has questioned the wisdom of what took place.
It taught me the horror and the atrocity of war. And, you know, you do think to yourself, well, is it worth it? But, of course, there are certain causes that are worth fighting for. It's never left me. I can still remember it. Not as sharply, perhaps, but I can still remember that day. Life was, believe it or not, a joy, because everything was reawakening. There was a blossoming, a sort of burgeoning of everything. And life was reasonably uneventful until about 6 years ago, when people began to reawaken an interest in veterans of World War II. And since then, well, it's been rather hectic. I know it sounds corny, but for me the word freedom has an intense meaning. And I think, you know, if you feel that what you're fighting for means you can remain a free human being, free to think your own thoughts, do more or less what you want, provided you're not breaking the law or something like that. Freedom is a wonderful, wonderful human commodity to have. You can do so much if you've got freedom. If you're an enslaved person, you can't.
Well, let's just pause and reflect for a moment. When we return, we'll hear from one veteran who arrived in Normandy by glider. Our final story on the podcast is that of Bill Gladden. Now, we spoke to him in November 2023 when, of course, we were aware of the approaching 80th anniversary of D-Day. Sadly, Bill died in April of this year, aged 100. The Daily team was incredibly privileged to have had Bill share his story with us before he passed. With his family's permission, this is Bill's D-Day story.
Our main mission was to find out where Jerry was and to let the division know, and then they let the RAF know, and then in they went with their rockets and just knocked them out.
In 1944, Bill was just 20 years old and serving with the 6th Airborne Reconnaissance Regiment. On the 6th of June, he arrived in Normandy, having flown there in a glider.
They were too near to be healthy for us.
He landed safely, but not everyone was so lucky. Bill recalls the moment two of his comrades were hit, and he carried their bodies to cover.
Well, the two who were killed, it's just that they were dug in on the edge of a pine forest, and when the Germans shelled us, they just hit the trees and burst down, and both of them were fatally killed there, and we carried them over to the old barn.
Just days later, Bill was himself carried away after being shot. He was to remain in hospital for 3 years.
Lots of memories, different hospitals, different sisters, different nurses and different doctors. That's all I remember.
Despite being so young, like many of his compatriots, he was well aware that he might not return from Normandy. And so, again, like many others, in the moments leading up to D-Day, he wrote a letter to his mum.
My dear mother, at last we've been given permission to write a letter in which we can state certain things which we were stopped from putting in other letters. We are now leaving this camp, and by the time you receive this letter, I shall be in France. You will have read all about it and also heard of it. I give you my love and all of the best of luck, health and love. Your ever-loving son, Bill.
Our thanks to Bill for telling us his story before he died, and thanks also to his family for allowing us to share it. As the commemoration events take place in Normandy and around the world, wherever you see a veteran, you'll find them flanked by current members of our armed forces. Everyone knows that war is hell, but none more so than those who've experienced it firsthand. Stories will be shared, some laughs and some tears also. They may not all be able to stand to take the salutes offered by their younger comrades. Their backs are not as ramrod straight as on the parade ground back in 1944. But those who landed in Normandy and those who supported them deserve as much respect now as they did when they returned home from war, having liberated Europe and defeated the Nazis. All that could ever defeat them was old age, and every year fewer and fewer make the trip to Normandy. We owe it to them to listen to their stories and never forget. That's your lot for this edition of the Sky News Daily. We'll see you again tomorrow.